In the year 465 BCE, beneath the towering limestone columns of the most opulent royal residence the ancient world had ever constructed, a woman was dragged screaming across the polished stone floors of a courtyard that was supposed to represent paradise on earth. What occurred in the moments that followed was an act of violence so profound and so grotesquely intimate that it silenced the whispers
of an empire that stretched from the Indus River to the Mediterranean Sea. The seasoned Persian guards, men who had marched across burning deserts and witnessed the slaughter of thousands on the battlefields of Greece, purportedly turned their faces away in sheer horror, unable to stomach the sight of what their queen was doing to a rival. The victim's only crime was possessing a quiet dignity that threatened the absolute authority of the royal family, specifically by refusing the advances of the King of Kings. But to view this event as merely a crime of passion or a singular moment of madness is to misunderstand the fundamental machinery of the Achaemenid Empire. This atrocity was not an aberration. It was the inevitable result of a decades-long social experiment that transformed the magnificent complex of Persepolis into a gilded cage of paranoia and psychological warfare. You likely know the name of the man who presided over this golden nightmare. You have seen caricatures of him in Hollywood blockbusters, painted as a pierced giant or a god king leading endless armies against the Spartans. History remembers Xerxes I as the man who burned Athens, the builder of the gate of all nations, and the ruler who challenged the West. That is the convenient narrative, the one that fits neatly into textbooks and movies about wars and monuments. But there is a much darker, far more disturbing history that was deliberately obscured by the golden dust of time. Behind the bas-reliefs of tribute-bearers and the inscriptions of divine favor lay a domestic battlefield where the weapons were not spears and arrows, but influence, access, and unspeakable cruelty. What if the most defining moment of Xerxes' reign was not the defeat at Salamis, but the systematic dismantling of his own humanity within the safety of his own home? What happens to a human psyche when it is fed a steady diet of absolute worship until it forgets the very definition of a person? Stay with me, because to understand the fall of the Persian Empire, we must look away from the battlefield and peer through the heavy curtains of the royal harem into a story so harrowing that it explains why the greatest dynasty of the ancient world ultimately cannibalized itself.
The ritual of proskynesis required that anyone entering his presence, be they a conquering general, a wealthy satrap, or a beloved relative, had to cast themselves flat upon the floor, kissing the dust at his feet. This was not merely a bow of respect, it was an act of total submission, a physical acknowledgement that the king was of a different species entirely. To look the king in the eye without permission was a capital offense. To keep one's hands outside their sleeves in his presence was seen as a threat. To speak unprompted was to risk execution. Imagine the toll this takes on a mind. For decades, Xerxes existed in a vacuum where no one ever told him the truth, where no one ever corrected him, and where genuine human connection was structurally impossible. The Greek historian Herodotus, who provides us with the most detailed, albeit hostile, accounts of this era, describes a court paralyzed by the fear of accidental offense. Even the highest nobility had to wait weeks outside the Apadana audience hall, hoping for a mere nod of acknowledgement, knowing that the king's mood determined whether they lived or died. This environment was not accidental. It was curated by his mother, Atossa. As the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the empire's founder, Atossa carried the blood of the dynasty in her veins and understood the lethal nature of court politics better than any general. She had survived the chaotic succession wars where brothers murdered brothers and pretenders were flayed alive. She taught Xerxes that in the viper's nest of the royal court, affection was a weakness and trust was a suicide note. She molded him into a ruler who viewed other human beings as mere extensions of his own desires, disposable tools to be used and discarded. This conditioning created a dangerous paradox: a man with the power of a god, but the emotional maturity of a spoiled child, terrified of vulnerability and obsessed with control. Nowhere was this dynamic more twisted than in the Anderun, the private quarters of the royal women.
Tablets from the Persepolis fortification archive reveal that royal women like her controlled massive estates, issued orders to workforce commanders, and managed their own economic empires. Yet despite this logistical power, their physical existence was entirely circumscribed by the king's will. They lived in extreme luxury, draped in Tyrian purple and adorned with gold from Sardis, but they were essentially high-status prisoners. They traveled in closed carriages, shielded from the gaze of commoners. Their interactions with men were restricted to the king and the eunuchs, castrated servants who acted as the eyes and ears of the throne. This isolation bred a pressure cooker atmosphere, where the only way to exert agency was through manipulation and dominance over the few people within reach. The women of the court, Amestris included, were raised to believe that this confinement was the highest honor in the world. They defended the very walls that imprisoned them, because those walls defined their status. But when you compress that much ambition and fear into a closed system, eventually it explodes. The explosion that shattered the perceived order of Xerxes' court began not with a war, but with a wandering eye. According to the accounts passed down through history, sometime after the disastrous campaigns in Greece, perhaps in the late 470s BCE, Xerxes turned his attention toward the wife of his own brother, Mecisteus. Mecisteus was a loyal satrap, a high-ranking commander who had served the empire faithfully. His wife, whose name has been lost to the sands of time, was a woman of noble standing, living within the strict moral codes of the Persian aristocracy. When the King of Kings, the ruler of the known world, propositioned her, she did something that was theoretically impossible in the Persian worldview. She said no. This refusal is a staggering moment of historical defiance. In a world where Xerxes could legally command the death of nations, this one woman drew a line in the sand. She rejected the divine right of the king to use her body. For a man conditioned to believe his whims were cosmic law, this rejection was incomprehensible. It didn't just bruise his ego, it fractured his reality. But rather than punishing her immediately, Xerxes, perhaps clinging to some shred of his own self-image as a benevolent ruler, or perhaps playing a longer, crueler game, shifted his obsession. He arranged a marriage between his own son, the crown prince Darius, and the daughter of Mecisteus, a young woman named Artante. It was a strategic move to bring the family closer, to entrap the mother by proxy. But once Artante was brought into the royal household, Xerxes' obsession transferred to her. Unlike her mother, Artante, young and likely terrified, did not refuse him. The King of Kings began an illicit affair with his own niece, the wife of his son. The horror of this situation is not just the incestuous betrayal, it is the calculated psychological torture that followed. Xerxes, having conquered the daughter, sought to use her to humiliate the mother who had rejected him. The instrument of this torture was a piece of clothing. Queen Amestris, with her own hands, had woven a spectacular robe for her husband. In the ancient world, weaving was a sacred duty of queens, and a garment like this was not just fabric, it was a symbol of her devotion, her labor, and her status as the king's partner. It was a masterpiece of gold thread and intricate embroidery.
One day, while with Artante, Xerxes, in a fit of arrogant generosity, promised the girl anything she desired in the entire empire. He swore a sacred oath to grant her wish. Artante, whether out of youthful vanity, manipulation, or perhaps a fatal lack of political awareness, asked for the robe Xerxes was wearing, the very robe Amestris had made. Xerxes tried to dissuade her. He knew exactly what that robe signified. He offered her cities, he offered her gold, he offered her command of armies, but she insisted on the robe. Bound by his oath, Xerxes handed it over. Artante not only took the robe, she wore it publicly. She paraded around the palace in the queen's personal creation. When word reached Amestris, the queen did not lash out at the girl. She was too smart, too cold, and too conditioned by the brutal logic of the court to waste for anger on a pawn. She understood that Artante was merely a symptom. The root cause, in her mind, was the mother, the woman whose initial rejection of Xerxes had set this entire chain of events in motion. Amestris concluded that the mother must be orchestrating this humiliation from the shadows. The queen waited for the perfect tactical moment to strike. She chose the king's birthday, the Tukta, the only day of the year when the king ceremonially washed his hair and distributed gifts to his subjects, and, crucially, a day when he could not refuse a request made by his queen. The royal banquet was a spectacle of excess, with thousands of animals slaughtered and wine flowing like rivers. Amidst this celebration, Amestris made her demand. She did not ask for jewels or estates. She asked for the wife of Macystus. She wanted her brother-in-law's wife delivered into her custody.
Xerxes was horrified. He knew his brother's wife was innocent of the affair. He knew this would tear his family apart. He tried to bargain, but the law of the Persians was unbending. The promise had been made in public. The king could not go back on his word without shattering his authority. With a heavy heart and a cowardice that defined his later years, he surrendered the woman to his wife. While Xerxes sent for his brother Macystus to try and explain the situation, telling him he must divorce his wife and take one of Xerxes' daughters instead, Amestris went to work. The brutality that followed is difficult to articulate. The queen's guard seized Macystus' wife and subjected her to mutilation designed to erase her identity as a human being. They cut off her breasts and threw them to the dogs. They sliced off her nose, her ears, her lips, and her tongue. They did not kill her. They left her alive, a ruined, breathing monument to the queen's wrath, and sent her back to her husband's house. When Macystus returned home and saw the mutilated form of the woman he loved, the woman who had bravely said no to the king, his loyalty to the throne evaporated instantly. He gathered his sons and his retinue and fled toward Bactria, his satrapy, intending to raise a rebellion. But the system Xerxes had built could not tolerate dissent. The king sent his trusted troops after his own brother. Macystus and his entire family, his sons, his daughters, and the mutilated wife, were overtaken on the road and slaughtered. An entire branch of the royal family was extinguished because the king could not control his lust and the queen could not control her rage. This tragedy marks a turning point in the history of the Achaemenid Empire. The golden facade of Persepolis had cracked. The Greek historians, particularly Herodotus, present this story as a morality tale about the corruption of absolute power. And while they may have embellished details, the core psychological truth resonates with the archaeological silence that follows. After this period, Xerxes largely withdrew from the public eye. The man who had marshaled millions to cross the Hellespont retreated into the depths of his palaces, surrounding himself with sycophants and eunuchs, drowning in paranoia.
He had seen that even his own blood was not safe.
He had seen that the absolute power he wielded did not bring him freedom. It brought him a cage of fear. The atmosphere in the court during the final years of Xerxes' reign must have been suffocating. The nobles walked on eggshells. The women of the Onderan lived in terror of Amestris' next mood swing. The empire continued to function. Taxes were collected and monuments were built, but the soul of the dynasty was rotting from the inside. The conditioning that Atossa had instilled in her son to trust no one and destroy all threats had reached its logical, cannibalistic conclusion. And in 465 BCE, the violence that Xerxes had allowed to fester finally came for him. The end did not come on a battlefield with a sword in his hand. It came in the dark, in his own bedroom, the one place where he should have been safe. The conspiracy was led by Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, the Hyrcanian, and a eunuch chamberlain named Achaemenid. These were the men tasked with protecting the king's life. They were the ones who watched him sleep. But the toxicity of the court had eroded all loyalty. They saw a weak, paranoid, and compromised ruler, and they saw an opportunity. In the dead of night, they entered the royal chambers and assassinated Xerxes I. But the bloodshed did not end with the king's death. The conspirators needed a scapegoat. Artabanus, displaying the same Machiavellian cunning that had defined the court for decades, went to Xerxes' younger son, Artaxerxes. He spun a lie, telling the young prince that his older brother, the crown prince Darius, had murdered their father to seize the throne. Blinded by grief and manipulated by the very system of distrust his father had perpetuated, Artaxerxes believed the lie. He ordered the execution of his own brother, committing fratricide to avenge a regicide that his brother hadn't committed. Only later, after the blood was spilled, did the truth come out. Artaxerxes eventually turned on Artabanus and the conspirators, executing them in a violent purge to secure his own shaky hold on power. But the damage was done. The precedent had been set. The Achaemenid court had become a shark tank, where survival meant striking first. This cycle of incest, murder, and intrigue would plague the dynasty for the next century and a half. The later kings would marry their sisters, poison their rivals, and execute their generals, locked in a death spiral that would only end when Alexander the Great marched into Persepolis in 330 BCE and burned the great palaces to the ground. Today, if you visit the ruins of Persepolis in modern-day Iran, you will see the skeletal remains of the Apadana and the 100-column hall. You will see the stone reliefs of the immortals, standing in eternal silence, their faces calm and orderly. The architecture speaks of harmony, of a world where the king brings order to chaos. It is a magnificent lie carved in stone. The true story of Xerxes' court is not written on the walls. It is whispered in the gaps between the history books. It is the story of Macistes's wife, the woman whose name was erased but whose suffering exposed the hollowness of the king's divinity. It is the story of Amestris, the queen who became a monster to survive a monster's world. It is the story of a civilization that perfected the art of empire, but forgot the value of the human soul. The tragedy of Xerxes is not that he failed to conquer Greece, it is that he succeeded in conquering his own humanity. He built a world where he was the only person who mattered, and in doing so, he ensured that he would die alone, betrayed by the very servants he treated as objects. This ancient saga serves as a timeless warning. It demonstrates that absolute power is not a shield. It is a solvent that dissolves the bonds of family, trust, and morality, leaving behind only fear and the inevitable slide into violence. The woman dragged into the courtyard in 465 BCE was not just a victim of a cruel queen. She was a casualty of a system that had lost its mind.
And as we look back at the glittering ruins of the Persian Empire, we must remember that the shiny gold of history often covers a stain of blood that no amount of time can wash away.
The story continues to unravel the deeper layers of this tragedy. Beyond the immediate horror of the mutilation and the massacre, we must look at the structural decay of the Achaemenid court. Historians like Ctesias, though often criticized for their sensationalism, provide a glimpse into the internal mechanisms of this decay. The eunuchs, often dismissed as mere servants, became the true power brokers. With access to the king's most private moments, they could whisper poison into his ear, shaping policy and execution orders alike. Achaemenid, one of the assassins, was not a warrior. He was a chamberlain. His power lay in his proximity. This shift from merit-based leadership, which characterized the reign of Cyrus and Darius, to a court dominated by intrigue and proximity, marked the beginning of the end. The satraps in the distant provinces, seeing the chaos in the capital, began to operate with increasing autonomy. Why remain loyal to a distant king who murders his own brother? The bonds of loyalty that held the vast empire together were fraying. The roads that once facilitated trade and rapid communication now carried rumors of instability. The celebrated royal road became a conduit for fear. In the provinces, local governors began to hoard tax revenues and build their own private armies, anticipating the vacuum of power. The Great Hall of 100 Columns, intended to showcase the unity of the empire's subject nations, stood as a hollow monument to a unity that no longer existed. The tribute bearers carved on the stairs of the Apadana, depicted bringing gifts with smiles, belied the growing resentment bubbling under the surface. The empire was not defeated by Greek hoplites or Macedonian phalanxes in the first instance. It was defeated by the moral rot at its center. The failure of Xerxes was a failure of character, amplified by absolute power. He allowed his personal desires and insecurities to override the stability of the state.
This era of Persian history serves as a case study in the dangers of isolation. When a leader is surrounded only by those who affirm his divinity, he loses touch with his humanity. Xerxes, in his later years, became a prisoner of his own propaganda. He could not conceive of a world where he was wrong, and thus he could not navigate a world that was complex. The assassination was, in many ways, a mercy killing of a reign that had already died in spirit years prior. The physical death of the king was merely the final punctuation mark on a long sentence of decline. And what of the women? What of Amestris? She survived. She outlived her husband, her son, and many of her rivals. She remained a powerful force in the court of Artaxerxes I, continuing to influence policy and exact vengeance on her enemies. Her longevity is a testament to the brutal effectiveness of her methods. In a system designed to crush women, she became the crusher. She adapted to the cruelty of her environment by becoming its supreme practitioner. But at what cost? The historical records do not speak of her happiness, only her wrath. They do not speak of her love, only her jealousy. She became a caricature of the wicked queen, a figure of fear rather than respect. And the unnamed wife of Macystus, she remains a silent ghost in the narrative. Her suffering was absolute, her end tragic, and her memory erased. She represents the countless unnamed victims of imperial hubris, the collateral damage of great men playing God. As we conclude this examination of the dark heart of Persepolis, we are left with a haunting question. How many other stories like this are buried under the sands of time? How many other voices were silenced to preserve the myth of the Golden Age? The ruins of Persepolis are beautiful, yes. They are a testament to human ingenuity and artistic achievement.
But they are also a monument to pain. They stand as a silent witness to the
Atrocities committed in the name of power. When we look at the Lamassu, the great winged bulls guarding the gate of all nations, we should not just see the glory of the empire. We should see the guards who turned their faces away. We should see the women who lived in fear. We should see the brothers who were murdered. We should see the cost. History is not just a collection of dates and battles. It is the story of human experience, of the best and worst of what we are capable of. The story of Xerxes and his household is a dark chapter, but it is a necessary one. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that justice is not guaranteed, and that even the most powerful rulers are ultimately just men, flawed, fearful, and finite. As the sun sets over the broken columns of Persepolis, casting long shadows across the Iranian plateau, we are reminded that all empires eventually fall. But the stories of those who suffered within them, those stories endure, whispered in the wind, waiting for someone to listen. This has been a journey into the hidden history of the Achaemenid Empire. Thank you for listening.